years, Baltimore has forged a path that city leaders promised would save the city. Tax breaks for developers and aggressive investments in policing. But that policy mix seems to hit more than a few roadblocks. The city police department has been under fire from the Department of Justice while crime has skyrocketed. Meanwhile, the tax breaks that were supposed to lure residents in the city ran into a major piece of bad news. A recent Census Bureau estimates that the city lost 6,000 residents. And all those shortcomings don't even touch the $130 million structural deficit facing city schools. But it's the policies themselves that have brought us here. And to help me understand the path the city has forged and its impact going forward are three people who covered the city and these issues in detail. Melody Simmons is a reporter for the Baltimore Business Journal who covers real estate and development. Luke Broadwater covers City Hall for the Baltimore Sun, and Stephen Janis is an investigative reporter for the Real News Network. But first, we have a package from Stephen on recent developments.
The story of how the city finds itself amid declining population and a fiscal crisis begins with this seemingly unremarkable piece of paper that has more implications for the city of Baltimore than its surface reveals. It's a new overtime slip recently issued by the Baltimore Police Department, obtained by the Real News. It requires officers to justify extra pay, which has skyrocketed this year, by checking a series of boxes. But it's not as innocuous as it seems. That's because for years the police department told us a detailed slip like this did not exist. In other words, getting overtime was easy. A point hammered home when 7 Baltimore cops were indicted, bragging about how easy it was to get overtime without working.
You know, we know that our city is challenged with revenue sources, and we have many competing interests, not only to within our own public safety community, but throughout the city, education, et cetera. The allegations of time and attendance and overtime fraud and overtime abuse, it's disgusting.
In fact, in a series of whistleblower interviews with city teachers, we learned that schools lack water, were infected with rodents, and often went without heat. Meanwhile, our cameras caught this: rows of take-home cars for police sitting in a lot, gathering dust. We asked police about them, but they would not comment. It is a juxtaposition of largesse and decay that has defined this city for decades. The question is, will it ever change? This is Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.
So, Luke, let me start out with you. In you recently sent out a tweet talking about police funding over the past decade. What did you say?
Well, if you look at the police budgets over the past 7 or 8 years, you'll see that there's a pretty rapid increase. Back in 2011, when the city experienced its lowest homicide rate in modern history, which was 197 homicides, the police department spent about $350 million, and that's including overtime and all other expenses. Today, the police budget stands at $480 million, so that's $130 million more. So you can see that there's been quite an increase over that time. And interestingly enough, that $130 million more is the exact size of the school budget deficit currently. So there is a movement now in city government among City Council President Jack Young, members of the City Council, and even Mayor Pugh herself to shrink these police costs and use some of that money to the school, to give some of that money to the school system. Jack Young has said he wants to cut $10 million from the police budget. He hasn't said exactly where that will be. Mayor Pugh has said she wants to cut about $5 million from the police budget, so we're looking at about a $15 million cut.
Now, why do you think the City Council and the City Council President is taking this new direction?
Well, I think they see a real need. You know, when you're talking about $130 million deficit in the school system and the potential for 1,000 layoffs, many teachers, that means classroom sizes would increase by some estimates of 10 students per classroom. Already, the city's having a hard time keeping population, and if class sizes rise in the Baltimore City public schools, many believe you will see more flight of parents and families who are worried about sending their kids to the public schools.
Now, Melody, we've heard from the Census Bureau that the city's population is declining, but when I look around Baltimore City, I see apartment complexes going up everywhere. How is this possible?
There's been a big boom in building of the multi-family developments here, and a lot of millennials are moving into the city. A lot of empty nesters are moving in. Did a story recently that said that the bubble, it could be a bubble, and the bubble could burst. Because they have overdeveloped, there's roughly close to 8,000 or 10,000 new units within the 1 mile radius of Harbor Place, of Pratt and Light, which is a lot. And there are more coming online. If you look over in Locust Point, you have Anthem House, 300 plus apartments going to open this summer. And then I was just down there this morning, and 414 Light, that giant tower, is very much coming out of the ground. So that will probably deliver late next year. So there's a lot of new luxury, high-priced apartments coming up.
Molly, how much do you think that has to do with the tax break that the Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, what was it, two or 3 years ago, about multifamily, where you have a sort of a pilot for 10 years? How much do you think it has to do with the building boom?
I think it has a lot to do with it. I think a lot of the developers latched onto that and ran with the ball, and I think that sunsets sometime in the next year or two. So that's one reason that there was a big rush to develop a lot of these properties. It's not only in that 1 mile radius from Pratt and Light, but if you go north, you're going to see a lot of building in Station North, Remington, further on up in the Jones Falls Valley with the old mills. So there's a lot of new development heading north, south, east, and west. So you're seeing it just starting to come online now.
So are the developers seeing something that we're not? Because the Census Bureau just said that we've lost up to 6,000 people. How do they feel so confident to keep building?
Well, I think the Census Bureau is probably a shocking figure to a lot of the developers. I think that this, the newest data, and of course we're, midway before the big, or we're a little over midway for the next big census, but this is kind of a canary in the coal mine to see what's happening, who's moving in here, what kind of population the city is going to have.
And I think what we're seeing, if you look at the census data, is we do see still good numbers in the young people coming into Baltimore, which is like 18 to 35, and then you have plus 55. Where we're really seeing the middle hollow out is from people from 35 to 55 with children who are leaving for the counties. And largely, if you want to look at it racially, the white population is increasing or staying the same, where it's really black families that are leaving to go to the counties. And I think if you look at the city's investment strategies and development over the past 10 years, where are you seeing the growth, where are you seeing the investment, where are the big tax breaks going? They're largely around the waterfront and in the majority white areas. And if you're not seeing the same investment in those other communities, well, it makes sense that people would leave.
That's really interesting that you mentioned the racial demographics of this. Now, to switch gears slightly, but also might play into why people are leaving, policing, police overtime abuse. Now, you said you recently received an overtime slip, a new one, to improve on the previous pattern and practice.
Well, it's interesting when you listen to what's going on when all the tax breaks have been given out. We obtained an overtime slip that the police department just issued. But what's remarkable about it is not that they have an overtime slip, but I asked the police about it, and they said, well, this is different because it asks officers to detail why they need overtime. In other words, they have to give some sort of justification with some sort of detail what they're doing. Now, why is that remarkable? Because as Luke has reported over and over again, the city's overtime has been unbelievably out of proportion to what the city has budgeted for it. It has consistently gone over. This year, it's about 40 million was budgeted, roughly around 15 million, right? Something like that. So what's remarkable about it, when we think of it in the context we're thinking about, a city with declining population, a city with a declining tax base, and a city with structural deficits in the school, is that they never asked police officers to give any sort of detail in terms of what they had to do, what they were doing to earn this extra money. And it's even more funny, or I guess more sad, that you have 6-7 officers who were just indicted who were making jokes about how easy it is to get overtime and you don't even have to work. Well, I mean, one guy was on vacation in South Carolina, right? I mean, but Luke and I have talked about, we have written about this. 10 years ago we wrote about this, and it was the same kind of stuff. And as Luke points out, in 2011 they actually reduced overtime, but they come right back and get it. And now the city is finally, after that decade period of time that we know of, actually asking people to give us some detail, like what are you doing? So it kind of shows a disconnect given the fiscal challenges the city's face and given the fact that they're giving out so many tax breaks.
It's interesting. Overtime is a privilege that costs the taxpayers money, but so are take-home cars. And you also, in that video package, talked about take-home cars, and you had some video of it.
Well, yeah, we went over to the police education training on Northern Parkway and videoed some take-home cars that had been sitting a lot for an extended period of time. We've asked the police about it, and it wouldn't comment. But one of the reasons we asked about it was because that same unit that was found to have, that was indicted by the police recently, they had multiple take-home cars. several of the officers had multiple. I mean, we have heard up to 3 to 4 take-home cars situated throughout the city. The expense is tremendous, and we've been asking for more information. But I did a story a couple of years ago where there were 22 cars going to Pennsylvania. Now, what does a take-home car mean? It means that a police officer has a free car with free gas and free maintenance at their disposal whenever they want it. Supposedly, this unit had tons of them. And the fact that we are dealing with the type of deficits, the type of loss of population, but the police department continues to sort of, what I would say, I think many people have said, indulge in these take-home cars and not righted this issue, again shows some of the disconnect in the city's fiscal situation compared to maybe where it should be.
I think other city agencies have had the take-home car controversy as well.
Absolutely.
The housing department with the lead paint settlement, they really got a judgment against them, and we're going to go and repossess the cars. And a lot of the inspectors and some of the executives in the housing department had Jeep Cherokees and were driving them all around town.
These types of perks are one of the reasons why we have these budget shortfalls, but casino gambling money was supposed to help take care of that. Now, Luke, you wrote a story about casino gambling, some of the concerns people had with using that money for school funding, and since we have a structural budget deficit, it seems like the money isn't being used wisely. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this has been a controversy since casino gambling was approved. Many people said at the time, yes, all the ads say, oh, this money is going to go to the schools, but let's look at the fine print. Does it actually say more money for schools on top of what would already be budgeted or not? The bill that was passed did not require more money to go to the schools, just that casino money went to schools. So right now we have about $2 billion that have been raised through the casinos. That's $2 billion
With the B.
with the in the Education Trust Fund. But what has happened is the schools are also, the state is required to fund the schools according to a formula. It's called the Thornton formula. And what has happened is they've just used the money to fund that formula and then taken percentages of the budget that would have gone to schools previously and used that on other things. So this might get a little wonky, but before the casino money came in, it used to be that 21% of the general fund went to schools, and now it's 18%. So they've taken 3% that would have gone to schools otherwise, and now they spend it elsewhere thanks to this casino money.
And that's the legal mandate, so they're working within the mandate.
Right. It's the bill that was passed, and that's how the law
And
works.
as you point out, Luke, when the ads really made it seem like this was going to be some sort of benefit, there was going to be increased funding, and I think that's why people feel. And now we've got a casino, which obviously, a teacher was just indicted, right, for stealing school funds and gambling in a casino. I mean, gambling has a lot of social costs. And yet, what are we getting out of it? We're not getting increased funding, just maybe the social costs. Yeah.
And this problem is most pronounced in Baltimore because there actually is no connection between casino money and school funding in the law. Baltimore's casino has brought in now close to $300 million, has pumped this out for the Education Trust Fund. At the same time, the city schools have gotten less money each year it's been opened from the state. So what's happening is the city's casino is actually funding all the other schools across the state and not the city.
That is really okay.
That's the funding formula.
So if I understand correctly, the casino money isn't supplementing, it's just sort of being replacing.
So that they can spend money elsewhere.
So that they can just use that money elsewhere. So it's not additional money being added to the school funding budget.
Right. Now the proponents of this it would say, hey, look, schools are a big cost. It's a big state. We've got lots of other priorities to fund. We've got to build roads and give money to hospitals and
pensions
and people's salaries and all this other stuff. So we can't just fund schools. So the casino money helps free up money for other things.
As much angst is going on right now about the funding, I think people should keep also eye on the prize that there are some new schools coming online. There will be some great opportunities for educators and students coming up in the next 5 years in the city.
Well, I just want to switch gears for a moment to talk about tax breaks for developers, because I know there is some impact of that on our school budget. Now, in Baltimore, it seems like the rich keep on getting richer. Wealthy developer Patarakis just sold his Legg Mason building for a profit, and Baltimore City was supposed to receive some benefit from that. What happened?
Well, what happened was they developed the Legg Mason building, Harbor East Management, which is H&S Bakery, an offshoot of the bakery, the Patarakis family. And of course, it's in Harbor Harbor East, which has become very successful, the Gold Coast in the city. And they didn't sell the whole building. They sold a stake in the building. They remain a partner, an owner of the building. They won't confirm the percentage. We think it's about 56% that the new CBRE global investors have purchased in the building, brought in a record price for real estate in Baltimore, close to $460 per square foot, which is a lot of money. But we're talking about the waterfront, we're talking about Harbor East. The flip side of that is that building had a pilot attached to it, and the new investor, CBRE, did not want to purchase the stake in the building with the pilot, so they went to the city and they asked to write a check to the city, $2 million, to have the pilot relieved, which passed. And so the building sale went through, it went to settlement, sans pilot. Pilot, of course, being a payment in lieu of taxes. So it does raise a lot of questions about how these tax deals operate, who they benefit.
Right.
There was no public airing of that. There was no hearing on that. It was not brought before the BDC, which is where the pilot is first introduced and discussed, and then into the city council chambers. We had none of that discussion at the time.
Why would
So-
they not want the pilot? I mean, what was the motivation?
I think my understanding, they won't really talk about it, but my understanding is that it was just a drag on the building, a drag on the value of the building and the future possibilities for it.
Because of the profit sharing aspect of it? Or?
There was a profit sharing attached to it, and I think that was part, in the long run, that was the holdup, that they didn't want to sign into and buy into and invest in that building with the profit sharing with the city.
Stephen, speaking of tax breaks, there is a tax break known as a TIF that has been very
Well, we were
controversial
talking-
in Baltimore. Can you talk a little bit about TIF?
Well, just so people understand, we should go. I mean, this is my understanding of TIFs, but of course, there's a big debate. It's called a tax increment finance, and the idea is that a sort of abandoned piece of property that has very little value, the city allows the developer to put the real estate, the taxes they would normally pay on property, into the building by capturing the value that is created by the actual TIF. Or by the tax break itself. But of course, as Melody has pointed out and Luke has pointed out, these TIFs have not gone to places that, generally, not gone to places that you would consider to be where they, I think they originated as the idea we'd be in a place that's kind of run down. I mean, that's not what's happened. And so you've seen a heavy concentration of TIFs in places that already have a lot of value. And the controversy is, we just had the huge TIF with Kevin Plank, who's the billionaire owner of Under Armour, shortly after the uprising of Freddie Gray and constant narrative about the city.
Right, it's one of the biggest TIFs in Baltimore City's history,
yeah, I think it's
right?
is it like
It
the
is the
third biggest in the
biggest.
country or something,
Yes,
or fourth?
third
Yeah.
biggest, second
So-
or third in the nation, but
Incredible.
definitely the biggest.
Well, what's fascinating about it is that it shows how the city has been cemented to this policy that you talked about at the beginning about policing and tax rate. Is that shortly after Baltimore City became the microcosm of poverty and inequity in the aftermath of the death of Freddie Gray and the uprising, they approved one of the biggest TIFs ever. Now, you can say, Kevin Plank would argue it goes into infrastructure, it builds buildings, but the bottom line is that all of us probably would like to put our real estate taxes into our property. And so this policy also, as you'll ask Luke about it, he reported on it, is going to have an impact on schools down the road. So it is something that locks this city in many of these deals for decades, and as Blake Mason showed, it even in the city has some protection.
They don't.
They don't.
It's almost like an easement, say a rural easement. It's supposed to be permanent. And the pilot, when it's set, and a TIF, and when it's set, is done so contractually, and it is for a set period of time. There are repayment schedules made up. And really supposed to go for 30 years. It's very rare and interesting to see how they were allowed to come in and just jettison from the pilot.
Yeah.
And of course, no public debate, no public communication.
Especially when the city would have benefited, I think, tremendously from if
Absolutely.
they had profit sharing, they probably would have done well.
Right.
Yeah, and so, and what we see, as you mentioned with the schools funding, is that when you do these 30-year deals and 10-year, 20-year deals, as an example, Port Covington. Port Covington is supposed to be $5.5 billion, right? That's going to be paying a ton of taxes, supposedly, should be.
Right.
But if you do a 30-year TIF with them, now all the tax money goes to improving the infrastructure down at Port Covington instead of doing things like funding the schools,
Right.
right? Because of these special deals. So, and we're seeing pilots, TIFs, the enterprise zone, apartment tax credits. There are so many all across the city that so many developers are not paying into the general fund, which can be used for the schools, that we see some of these school budget shortfalls.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, can you tell me a little bit more about the impact of TIFs on school funding?
Yeah, so, and this is something that the General Assembly is going to be grappling with. Unfortunately, they haven't really done anything of substance yet on it. And so we're still seeing the impact. This year alone, about 12 million of the 130 million deficit is due to the rising wealth of the city, but at the same time not having the corresponding tax revenues because of all these special deals. So it doesn't fix the whole school budget problem, but it does fix some of it. So right now there's debate over whether we can change the law, change the funding formulas to prevent some of that from happening.
You know, I have an interesting thought. Have we ever really? I know Carl Stokes kind of did a report about a couple of years ago about TIFs, but is there any sort of collective assessment of what all these different programs are costing the city in terms of tax revenue? I mean,
There is. It lives in the finance department. Do they update it? It's very rare.
I mean, I've seen that one-page report. Is that what you're talking
The
about?
task force report?
Yeah, I saw the
Yeah.
task force. Yeah.
Right. Well, what's happened is, and BDC is supposed to really be a shepherd of this because that's, they're the development and also in conjunction with the finance department. But we don't see it, and they claim they don't have the staff to monitor. So it's very difficult to see how that path goes once it is voted on and signed and the bonds go to market to private investors. It kind of stops there. There have been several instances with TIFs in the city where they couldn't make the payment. They didn't have enough tax revenue to pay the bondholders, so they had to have a special tax. And this is something that is, it's the last case scenario in a TIF when you structure it together, but it has happened, and I think that this is always a big worry. I believe that this is why they put the apartments in the Exelon building to get some rental revenue. Those apartments just appeared at the UDARP. Boom, we're putting 100 apartments in. What? So we had that, and really the reason is to get the revenue to repay the TIF. So it was a financial decision.
And this year, it's either this year or next year, there's new accounting standards where the city will start to have to include in its annual financial audit how much money it forgoes from all these special tax deals.
That's really important.
So I'm going to be very interested to see what they calculate that number as.
It's coming.
Yeah. I can do my own calculations, but with so many projects all across the city getting this wide array of tax deals, it's very hard to do. So
That's amazing. So and before they just didn't track it really in any.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
they didn't.
I've seen that report. It was a very meager report. It wasn't like there's got 4 or 5 analysts sitting there. You think the city would? It's almost like they don't want to know.
Well, I was in the meeting. We've been to countless meetings on these topics, and the question was asked. It's a valid question, and the answer was, we don't have the staff. And I think a lot of people in the room, kind of sat back. But I will say that the Port Covington TIF is going to be run through the state, not the city. It was too much money for the city's debt load because the TIFs do count against the debt load of the city, and that impacts a lot your credit rating and your bond rating. So it has a rollover effect on Baltimore, which is why it's gone up to the state, and the state will guarantee those bonds.
Which really speaks to the problem of why don't we just reform the entire tax system, because obviously developers are using our double high tax rate as leverage to negotiate deals for themselves. It's almost like, we have been we're trapped because our tax rate is, you move over a little line, you're paying 1/2 the property taxes. It has trapped us in this, horrible cycle, it seems like.
It's a valid argument. They use it, and they can pull the figures out to show it.
Right, exactly.
And so this is what happens, and this is what you hear. There's two sides to the story, and that's one side right there, is that the city's tax rate is too high. We need an incentive, and this is the infrastructure that a TIF puts in is something that is the city's responsibility, even though in the county, the developers do pay for their own infrastructure.
And they pay an impact fee.
And a fee.
Do you think this is sustainable for Baltimore City? It seems like we're giving away our revenue.
I don't know. Overall, I think the development has been great for the waterfront, but you see what it's created, and a lot of people say there are 2 Baltimores, possibly 3. And I think that if you look directly to where some of this TIF money has gone and where it hasn't gone, you can make that argument, and it's valid.
Luke, let me ask you the same question. Do you think that the city's tax break policy, handing out TIFs, do you think this is sustainable?
Sustainable. That's an interesting question. I don't know. One of the obviously the main problem here is that Baltimore has twice the tax rate of its surrounding jurisdictions, as we've all said. So I do understand the desire of city officials to try to stimulate the economy with different special deals, right? The problem is that when you start picking winners and losers, now you're inserting the city's hand, the mayor's hand, into the economy and saying, well, this business is favored, this one's not, this neighborhood's favored, this one's not, and so you are, in fact, as Melody says, helping to create divides, right? So to me, I don't, is there a way to bring down the tax rate, give out fewer of these deals, and have a more fair playing field for everybody? I think if that were done, a lot of people would appreciate that.
Well, to Luke's point, which is a very important point, one thing that's never anticipated, all of us who sat in those meetings, is the possible failure of any of these projects. I mean, Melody can tell us that, the vacancy rates downtown are what, 20%, 18%?
It's been hanging around 20 for years.
So we have got scheduled not only empty apartment buildings, but empty possibly office building. I mean, we're building millions at 3 million square feet in Port Covington. So the idea, some of these projects might fail. And it's never, Municap, there's a company called Municap which does the analysis, but I think they're paid for by the developer. And if they're already saying we can't monitor these things, the idea going forward that somehow all these projects are going to pay off and pay all their debt, and that Kevin Plank, who's making sneakers and t-shirts, is suddenly going to be able to develop a massively complex development with total efficacy, I think is really sort of if you want to look at an example, look at the hotel. The hotel was billed as it was going to be a net positive for the city was just going to rake in money because there was no private person wanted to do it. No private company, but the city, because the city's at advantage in terms of municipal bond rates, was going to be able to do it. And we're going to make millions of dollars. Well, guess what? The city's now supporting those bonds. So that's the problem with this. There is they're playing, as Luke points out, they're playing free market God without really any of the sort of precautions that a true free market decision would have. These are all political decisions, and sometimes political decisions really fail, and the city could be on the hook for tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
That hotel, the Hilton?
The Hilton Hotel, yeah.
I think you could do a doctoral thesis on that. I
Yeah.
mean, it's still rolling. It's still a story that's very much viable. But if you look at just go back to, square one, when it was proposed by Mayor O'Malley at the time, and then he really had to strong arm and made promises to get that everything passed through the council. I remember
it was
one
a
of the
close vote.
councilwomen, it was very close. He promised a new rec center. She got it. It closed a year later, but she got it. Things like that, and that's how they got that legislation through and built the hotel. And we're now seeing everything that people predicted on that hotel it's in living color right there.
Yeah, well, everything was wrong. The consultant hired by the city said it was just going to make so much money they wouldn't know what to do with it. But the exact opposite happened, which people like Haywood Sanders, who is a professor of public policy at University of Texas, San Antonio, said, look, it's not going to work. There are too many hotels. And he was right. I mean, the city's basically subsidizing it at this point.
That's going to have to be the last word. And during this episode of The Real Baltimore, we diagnosed some of the problems, and I'm hoping in the next one we can delve in more deeply into the solutions. I want to thank my guests, Luke Broadwater, Melody Simmons, and Stephen Janis for joining me. I'm your host, Taya Graham. Thank you so much for watching The Real Baltimore.